We come to the 10th presentation, and we're understanding that there is a symmetry, and that the symmetry has a limit of peculiar qualities. If you go to the very small, that limit shrinks towards zero. If you go to the very large, that perimeter expands towards infinity. If you would achieve a symmetry between achieving zero, you would also at the same moment, same point, achieve infinity. So that the structure in between is symmetrical around symmetry of infinite or zero measurements. And this is why any structure that has a symmetrical form in between tends to have a peculiar kind of a resolution to it. Do a computation, not in arithmetic, but in mathematics and in logic together, you can interchange zero and infinity in any logical structure, and it will still have the same logical veracity. It will not affect the form of logic at all. In mathematics is that these are approachable, but are they achievable? In our time, for the last generation or so, string theory has been vying to try to come to understand what infinity might be. And in Michio Kaku's book, Introduction to Superstrings and M-Theory, written right at the beginning of the 21st century to bring us up to date, and by bringing us up to date, we'll have reference to a January 31st, 2008 Science Daily article, Scientists Propose Test of String Theory Based on Neutral Hydrogen Absorption. Neutral hydrogen is one proton, one electron. It is the fundamental polarity by which the gauge of elements is constantly laddered up and constructed. Kaku, at the beginning of chapter 11, entitles it M-Theory and Duality. Up to now, none of the methods discussed in this book have provided us with deep insights into non-perturbative string theory and its true vacuum. A true vacuum would be a true zero. There are still gaps in our understanding of the string perturbation theory because of the problems associated with supermoduli, and the ultimate supermoduli would be infinity. So we're looking at a mathematical theory that is doing something that transcends the limitations of logic, and the limitations of logic are that the zero and infinity are interchangeable as units. They can be fit into a logical statement and argument and presentation and not change the logical structure. They are interchangeable in terms of their conceptual oneness, a zero, and infinity. This is a crucial limitation of logic. And as long as mathematics continues to still anchor itself on logical structure, it cannot free itself to gain wings to fly above the duality. The duality which is emphasized by an overemphasis of carrying unity into zero and unity into infinity. They do not carry, neither of them carry into unity. In fact, unity emerges whole out of zero, and unity proliferates endlessly into infinity. The link in that is not the oneness in all of the realms and scalars in between, but in the mystery of how infinity is zero. And it is difficult to use language to say how this is. The classic first way in which this was presented, we talked about last week, was a first generation Pythagorean named Parmenides, living in southern Italy, living near the Bay of Tarentum, and his classic wisdom poem from about 500 BC was a famous conundrum in classical Greece, and it was brought to an enormous, sophisticated resolution by Plato in a dialogue called Parmenides. And Parmenides is a part of a set of Platonic dialogues that are very advanced. One would have gone through, by that time in Plato's Academy, maybe 6 sets of 4 dialogues, and by the time you got to where the Parmenides is, you're dealing with sophisticated, ultra-sophisticated ways that literally do end runs around logic. And by doing end runs around logic, avail themselves of being able to comprehend that unity emerges from zero, but it gets lost in infinity. And so the Parmenides has a famous statement in it that the only way that 2 people arguing pro and con about this can have a resolution is that there has to be a third man. There has to be someone for whom it is not the pro and con of the argument. It is the resolution of the impossibility, letting it be impossible, and yet recognizing that impossible though it is, logically, it still occurs. So that one does not have simply 2 forms of drama. One does not simply have tragedy and comedy, but one has a third form, which is mystery. Mystery is a dramatic form that is itself a distillation of a previous third in between tragedy and comedy, and that previous third, that previous resolution was history. So when you find someone who is enormously sophisticated about dramatic shape and process like Shakespeare, his plays distribute themselves into tragedies, comedies, and histories. But two of his plays do not distribute into either tragedy or comedy or history, but they become mystery plays. And the two are Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. So that Shakespeare is like a guiding prism for us to look back through and realize that tragedy and comedy and history were all born together in classical Greece, and that the foundation of that was the original way in which mystery was kept mysterious. That it was not ever given a logical form. The mysteries were mysteries. One did not argue about them. One did not talk about them. They were not logical. And so the word that I'm going to use is an ancient Jewish word, the shibboleth about mysteries, is that you have to participate in them. You cannot argue them. They do not have a logical form or process or method, and therefore they were originally called irrational. And there's a great book by E.R. Dodds, a Sather Classic lecture from UC Berkeley, now about 50, 60 years ago, The Greeks and the Irrational. It is not that mysteries are irrational, it's that they are of the ecology of consciousness, and that the rationality, the ratioing, the proportioning, is a high art that is not logical, but actually is what is called aesthetic. The beauty of an irrational mystery transcends completely the limitations of a logic-based rationality, so that an arithmetic which is logical in its structure, a geometry which is logical in its structure, are transcended. The arithmetic becomes a mathematic, and the geometry becomes a trigonometry, and then becomes a sphericality that has superspheres. And we talked a couple of times about Riemann spheres having a very complex kind of higher math that has been useful since they were introduced by Bernard Riemann in the late 1850s. What is important for us is to recognize that logic is not conscious. Consciousness is a different kind of dimensionality from where logic is applicable, where a geometric is applicable, where a limitation that assumes that unity is fundamental as a pivot, and that proportionality always is a ratioing of aspects of a unity. The emphasis on this is graphic because in trying to work with this, one works with equations. The identification of the two sides of an equation, the two halves of an equation, makes it a ratio, makes it ratioable in terms of the unity, the equals symbol. Whatever substituting one does, it's always within the logical context that there is an identification that holds, there is a polarity that can be balanced, and that the balance is the justification. The scales are even, and that justification is the truth of the matter. And if the equations work out, no matter what you have done on either side or both sides of the equation, you tend to want to preserve that unification pivot assumption. Consciousness does not need that presupposition because it is of a higher dimension from the realm in which an arithmetic or a geometry or an equation or a logic would have its ability, even in balance, even in complex balance, to the old word for it was to be relevant. It simply is not relevant. One does not go to Eleusis to find the equation. One doesn't go to Delphi to find the equation. One goes to participate in the mystery. And the mystery is a second transformation refinement from the first transformation refinement, which is history. And the root of how history comes into its flow is that it is a kaleidoscopic complex flow, like a very complex river delta. And the flow of the complexity of historical streams flows in a field of visionary differential consciousness. Very similar to, in fact, parallel in remarkable ways to, the way in which a logical structure, seeking its referent in existential things, in existential actions, in the symbolic connectors that put this together in that balance, and that this happens within the field of nature, and that the field of nature is very much like the field of consciousness, except that the natural field is integral and the conscious field is differential. If you were to visualize them, you would visualize a field phenomenon that looks very much as if it were, if you could visualize it, looks like a spiral. And it is the spiral that gives it a very peculiar quality. Because when you put them together, you have a double spiral in parallels, and it's very much like the structure of the double helix of DNA. When we're looking to understand logically the structure, then, of how this double helix in parallel of DNA works, it does have an encodement, which does have a transmission which can be read out. But it is not limited to a logical form. It participates in a mysterious dimension. Not only a mysterious dimension, but that achieving that mysterious dimension means taking the ecology of the vision of consciousness, its visionary field, and giving it a similar, not exact, a similar development. So that the similar development is that nature allows for the emergence of forms, existential forms, selected action forms. A certain species of bird will build a nest in such a way Other species of birds will build nests in different ways. Certain insects will build nests in those ways. Other insects will build exactly their nests in other ways. The selected snippets of ritual and the existential things emerge out of the field of nature and tend to be repeatable in terms of a cycle. And that cycle then continues itself by generating experience. The insects will have a certain quality, we say largely instinctual, or birds or animals, plants, that they will generate in their life the unfolding of this. And that for us, our experience is more refined, more complex. But it leads then to the integration where everything will come together in a kind of a neural structure, and that for our kind of unity, it integrally comes to be where the brain and the neural structure together give us the ability to have symbolic thought, to bring us to the completion where we can have a logical structure to thought, which not only can be spoken of in experience, but it can be written down in terms of writing alphabets, pictographs, expressions. And that what controls that entire cycle is the ability to have the cycle completed in such a way that it reoccurs. It cycles. It not only is a cycle, but it is cyclic. It recycles itself through fertility. The parallel in consciousness is that the forms that come out are forms that are not integral, but they're prismatic, they're differential. Works of art, spiritual persons, the rainbow spectrum of a mathematical understanding that some visionary theory now will express itself in such a range of probability. It is not that the probability must remain logical, but that the probability is literally a movable feast and can explore out of probability into a realm of possibility. That there can be an imaginative possibility that transcends the expected probability, in which case you get something literally fresh, literally new, literally not unique so much because that's an assumption of unity, but that the possibilities then of possibilities are unlimited. They are, in fact, infinite. Not just endless, but infinite. And infinite in the sense that the fifth dimension of visionary consciousness makes a six-dimensional form that is prismatic, works of art, spiritual persons, and they, in turn, engender a higher dimension of the historical kaleidoscopic flow. And out of that comes yet a even more refined, more complex form, which the original word for it from Pythagoras was a cosmos. And that what we do when we formally inquire of, when we study the cosmos with an historical approach that is founded in a theoretical what if. The theory is not of the logical structure, but is of the visionary insight. Vision having both remembering and recognition and creative imagining. So that a mathematic is an art. Mathematics is an art. And the art of mathematics is that it is able to open itself up differentially and not only approach infinity, but to recognize and remember and creatively include a true zero, which is not just the idea of zero, but the mystery of what a zero, not what it would be, but that it would not be at all. And that's the entire point. It would not be a high vacuum. It would indeed occur, high vacuum, which means that it would not occur in the structure of thought. It would not occur at all in the method of logic. It would be mysterious in experience. The fact that it is occurring and not experienced is exactly the revelation. It's called a theophany. And a theophany at its base, when you first get the glimpse of it in vision, it's called an epiphany. We're using Greek words now. The epiphany allows for the seed of insight to acquire the ability to be fertile and to develop itself in terms of an art form, in terms of an aesthetic. So that an aesthetic is not logical. It is beautiful. An aesthetic has a differential complementarity to a politic. Politics is integral, aesthetics are differential. And as the aesthetics opens up, the politics seeks to bring it together. It isn't that compromise is the art of politics. There's no art of politics. It is the structure of bringing everything together so that there is agreement. It isn't compromise. It's that the agreement is reached upon as being the better integral. So that there is a great deal of difference then, like a watershed. And that watershed is the difference between 1 and 0, because an integral will always assume that integrality carries all the way through. And even sophisticated yogis like Sri Aurobindo that we have talked about, his was an integral yoga. The development of the School of Integral Studies in San Francisco that was once there with Haridas Chaudhuri, has become, many years ago, it first became the Academy of Asian Studies, Ernest Hunt and Alan Watts, and then after Chaudhuri, it became the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is still there. But they do not teach mystery. They do not, in fact, really teach history. They teach the dualities that then, when they're in balance in their complex equationality, that one then has a way of understanding psychology, a way of understanding integration. All of this carries over into the disciplines that seek to participate in mysteries and do not. They cannot. They simply do not. One of the great watersheds in this was published by the American Philosophical Society, Independence Square, Philadelphia, 1963. It was a 10-year celebration of the development of the discovery of the double helix by Watson and Crick in 1953. The author, George W. Beadle, was the president of the University of Chicago. The series was given in 1962 in honor of the 1952 achievement of the model and the theory, and then it was published the following April in Nature. When you see the frontispiece, it looks like this. And when you look at the upper photograph that's there, these are human chromosomes, and they're not arranged in an egg crate grid. They are in a play, free form quality, and this happens to be the chromosomal arrangement of a female human being because there are two X chromosomes and they're illuminated in the photograph with little X's on them. This is being able to envision the play of creativity, of recognition, of remembering, so that the code is not mechanical, but it's mnemonic. It has an application which has a creative play in it. And within the chromosomes, within the entire structure, one has a very interesting thing. You have a series of double helix DNA strands that are extremely small. And it is something to Beetle's great comprehension. He was trying to give an estimate of the sizes of DNA. He said, assuming 5-letter words with a space for each word, each of these would make about 12,000 words or 24 printed pages of 500 words each. This is for a T4 bacterial virus. A similar calculation for the information carried in the DNA molecules of a single human cell, first made by Crick, indicates that the 5 billion nucleotide pairs are the equivalent of 1,000 printed volumes of 500 words each on 600 pages per volume. If this amount of DNA were strung together on a single long molecule, it would be about 5 feet long and about 1/10,000,000th of an inch in diameter. Folded back and forth on the head of a pin so as to form a solid film equal in thickness to the diameter of a DNA double helix, about 20 angstrom units. Angstroms are units of the light frequency. Only about a 200th of the head of a pin would be covered. To cover it completely would require about 200 such molecules, the equivalent in information to 200,000 printed volumes of the size indicated previously. Another way of dramatizing the miniaturization of information coded in DNA molecules, if the DNA of all the human egg cells that have given rise to the present world population, 3 billion, and we'll multiply it by 2 for 2009, if they were stacked neatly like cord wood, it would fit nicely into a tiny cubical box 1/8 of an inch on a side. There would be room to spare. All of the DNA of the entire human population currently could be fitted into a 1/4 inch size cube. We're trying to understand not only the very small, but at the same time, the very large. So before we take the break, I want to give you a little paragraph from the March 13th, 2008 issue of Nature, Eyes as Big as the Sky, about the new giant telescopes that are being made now. This is at the Stewart Observatory Mirror Laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. Tucson has a planetary institute there. Still unpolished and milky white, the disk sits like a record on a turntable, except that this record is borosilicate glass instead of vinyl and spins at 1 revolution per minute instead of 45, and weighs as much as 3 buses. Martin, a polishing scientist, is the disc jockey. He needs to shape the surface like a saddle and get it right to within 20 nanometers. Proportionately, it is like bulldozing all of Brazil to the smoothness of less than a centimeter. Thus, Martin's anxiety over errant scrapes. We have rules such as no tools above the glass. A wrench falling would break it. When Martin can confirm that the glass is polished correctly, it will be ready to become a mirror. Technicians will seal a giant glass bell jar over the glass and vaporize a soda can's worth of aluminum over the surface. The results will be as large or larger than all but 2 of the telescope mirrors currently in the world, but that is only the beginning. The Giant Magellan Telescope, GMT, pictured above, which is under development by a consortium led by the Carnegie Observatories in Pasadena, California, and the University of Arizona, will require 6 more mirrors just as big. If the first mirror is Brazil, then there is still the rest of the Americas, all of Europe, and a good chunk of Africa to go. When these 7 mirrors are put together, the GMT will be 25 meters across, dwarfing the biggest telescopes in the world, jumping the factors almost asymptotically, so that our movement into the infinite is technically now very close to feasibility of actuality. When we come back from the break, we'll take a look at the state of a star system-wide civilization as of March 7th, 2009. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the 21st century. The strongest mathematical visioning is now balanced in between equation truly exotic and a different way of doing mathematics by Feynman diagrams. And next week we'll take a look at the creative possibility recognition quotient of Feynman diagrams versus the inability of equational mathematics, no matter how acrobatic, to be able to not just describe, but to express what we would like to consider real. A few sentences of Kaku. Again, chapter 11, M-theory and duality, with the asterisk that duality is a mental presupposition that does not occur in a unification way. And we'll come back to that. Here's Kaku. A couple of sentences. One of the most interesting new approaches to non-perturbative string theory, that means instead of getting a perturbation, a deformation of something in order to discover what it is and what's going on, how then it works with this perturbation, which in fact force us to reconsider the central role played by strings in supersymmetry. And next week we'll take a look at a supersymmetricality. Not only have they given us surprising results concerning the non-perturbative behavior of string theory, they have also forced us to reconsider previously discarded theories, including supergravity and membranes of various dimensions, called p-branes, which are now seen in an entirely new light. In particular, duality allows us to show that the 5 different self-consistent superstring theories are nothing but different solutions of a single theory called M-theory. In this revised picture, the various string theories are nothing but different vacua of a single theory. And he goes on later on in the chapter to talk about F-theory. So far, the unification of the 5 superstring theories is quite remarkable, but there are many loose ends. In particular, it seems odd that M-theory, existing in 11 dimensions, cannot be directly reduced down to type 2B superstring theory in 10 dimensions. Instead, and then he goes on to describe the mathematical strategies that this is a peculiarity. We need to open this up beyond logic into mystery to appreciate what it is that has been presented here for quite some long time and worked on for the last half century. Let's work our way up to 11 dimensions. If we take the 4 dimensions of space-time, which make an integral cycle, it is the natural integral. And though it has variations that are a part of it, the overall strategy, the overall base is that every particle is a particle. Every collection of particles becomes a unity. There is an atom, there is a molecule, there is a protein, there is a cell, there is a species, this being, us, etc. Those 4 dimensions, space-time in an integral cycle, face a complement of 4 dimensions that constitute not a cycle, but an ecology of further dimensioning. And the ecology of further dimensioning begins with visionary consciousness, but its cycle is not a cycle, but an ecology, and it's an ecology of differentiality. Not differentiation, but differential. Variation and differentiation are a concomitant part of integraling. Differential consciousness, to use the full phrase, does something that is complementary to the integral cycle. If we look at Beetle's page of one of the early classic presentations of the double helix, you can see that they are pitched exactly at a repetitive angle. It's not necessary to say anything more than that, but that the parallel helixes go in opposite directions. If they did not go into opposite directions, you would get an integral-only parallelism that would not be fertile. They not going in opposite directions, but they go in paired complementarity directions. So that the double helix is not a duality helix structure. It's not a logical order. It is a dramatic aesthetic order that depends upon its success and ecological continuing to have a spectrum of possibilities that allow for elements within the DNA, within the encodement, to have parts of it, sections of it, snippets of it that can move around creatively. They're called transposons. And the discoverer of them was Barbara McClintock, who was a lifelong friend of George Beadle. They worked together in labs for many years together. And I'll bring a photograph of Barbara McClintock and George Beadle and a number of other early geneticists who worked together. What's important here is to recognize that the 4 dimensions of space-time become in a complementarity, not space-time, but time-space. Time is not the 4th dimension then, but is the 1st. And one has to recognize this because when you get into relativity theory, time tends to become infinite. The faster that one approaches the limit, the speed of light. And while it becomes infinite, it also becomes standstill zero. That the movement of time and the extent of space approaches zero infinity. Which is why then the limitation of the integral theory of relativity is that it is a theory that is fed back into a logical structure, into an equational strategy that is self-limiting the more that one stretches it to its liminality. Not just limits, but even the beginning perceived insight that this is not going to work, or that the equations begin themselves of their own methodologically applied work begin to churn out infinities and zeros prolifically in the equations that one has to somehow filter, to get rid of, to renormalize, because it is not possible to work in a logical way with either zero or infinity. However, an aesthetic, prismatic way of dealing with them is to allow for the theory not as a mental idea, but as a seed of differential conscious visioning. In that case, the transform is from arithmetic to a theoretical arithmetic. And this was the crucial development that Pythagoras introduced into planetary history. And one of the classic books on Pythagoras is the theoretical arithmetic. That theoretical arithmetic, the best English translation was done about 200 years ago by Thomas Taylor. And it's still in print in various forms, and you can find copies of it. The theoretical arithmetic is a bridge between the ordinary arithmetic used previously and the development of a mathematic whose first step was trigonometry. Going from a geometry to a trigonometry allowed for theoretical arithmetic to have a way of being paired with an insight that number has a mysterious prismatic form and not just a cardinal logical structure. And the classic way of presenting this was not to count 1, 2, 3, 4, but to simply use dots for the numbers. A dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots. And that arranged in this way, those 10 dots make a triangle, an equilateral triangle. In this way, Pythagoras' tetragrammaton was an equivalent of a Feynman diagram 2,500 years ago. And one of the insights that he had doing this was that that particular structure of 1, 2, 3, 4 presented in this graphic way allowed one to escape the logical structure and to go into a mysteriousness. One of the keys to that was not only his studying in Egypt for 22 years in the Heliopolis magnificent center and being one of the wisest students of all time of the Heliopolis recension. There is a quality of him spending 11 years in the Persian Empire milieu at the time of Cyrus the Great, who at this time was bringing Zoroastrian wisdom back into play and founding the Achaemenid Empire. But the cream of intellectual Jewish exiles in the exile was split, most of them going into Babylon, the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the capital then for a while until Persepolis was built of Cyrus the Great's Persian Empire. And the genius Jewish sage in that exile was Ezekiel. The genius Jewish sage in exile in Egypt was Jeremiah. And if you locate then that there is a kind of a triadic quality of Pythagoras and Jeremiah to Ezekiel with the interesting kind of array of that triad within a Zoroastrian understanding, one comes to a very interesting thing. The classic wisdom of Zoroaster is that there are 6 Holy Spirits, the Amisha Spenta, and together they come into a focus of Ahura Mazda, but the understanding is always that it's 2 words. Ahura Mazda, there is an Ahura, there is a Mazda, then there is an Ahura Mazda. So that the 7th is actually a ratioing of 2 that have become 1. And this is a classic case then, that the 7 is really an 8 if one understood the ecology of it, but that the cycle of it reads out as a 7. In other words, a Sabbath, a 7th, as a holy day of rest after 6 days' work, has this kind of echoing with the ancient Mosaic understanding of creation, that after 6 days God rested, and on the 7th day he took stock of what the 6 days had brought. One of the esoteric statements that for 400 years has coursed through esoteric structures in the West, Rosicrucianism, Masonic orders, etc., is the 6 days' work, the college of the 6 days' work. The 7th day, one does not do work, but one recognizes in reflection upon that set of 6, so that the 7th is always something that is not so much a part of the set, but is the parentheses that makes it a set. So that the 7th is a parenthetical, it is not the same as the other aspects to it. They are the resonances, but the harmonic is the parenthetical set, which can be understood logically as a parenthesis, but which in vision is a pair of parentheses. So that pairedness is at the deepest core of the ecology of consciousness, which shows that it is tunable. The parentheses are like a tuning fork, which can then be stepped up, so that when you step it up, the tuning doesn't go in a cardinal sequence, it goes in a sequence of powers. Instead of getting 2, 3, you get 2 to the second, 4. And the next is 2 to the third, 8. 2 to the fourth would be 16. 2 to the fifth would give you 32. 2 to the sixth step you up to 64. That when you get 2 to the sixth, the 2 to the seventh is something that you don't have to continue with, but it is now a space of a contemplation of the powers having stepped up its ordinality, so that consciousness becomes ordinal and the integral becomes cardinal, and that they can work together, but they do not just braid together, they weave. And it's this woven quality of the 4 dimensions of the integral and the 4 dimensions of the differential, vision, art, history, and science, as dimensions, that when they are brought together, that 8 now does not just make an additional 8, but they relate together as a complementarity whose veracity is a 9th dimension. One of the classic Hermetic documents that was lost for more than 1,500 years was discovered with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts at the end of World War II in Egypt. One of the treatises in there is the 8th reveals the 9th. And it says clearly in there that when one enters the silence of the 9th, one hears the silent choir praising God in the 10th. So that one now has a very interesting kind of correlation together, and that is that the 10th is like a perfect 10. It's a Pythagorean 10, because the Hermetic development was also not just high Dharma of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, of St. John, of Philo, of Apollos, of the whole Alexandrian first century sophistication, but also brings in, again, the weaving of Greek and Phoenician and Hebrew and Zoroastrian and Egyptian wisdoms into a pliable spectrum, like a shimmering fabric of light. And this was noticeable about 2,000 years ago. The development at that time is that for the very first time, one had a way to step up into the mystery. And when one could step up into the mystery through dimensional phases, now there was an opportunity to understand the mystery of mysteries. The mystery of mysteries is that the 10, though it generates mysteriously an 11th dimension, the 11th dimension does not record, but occurs as a 0 field, which is the field of nature. So that the 10th dimension comes like a form. Michio Kaku, I started weeks ago with his book on hyperspace. the 10 dimensions of hyperspace, which one can get to as a fifth kind of form, as a quintessential kind of form. The first forms are existential, ritual. The second forms are symbolic. The third forms are art. The fourth forms are scientific, namely the cosmos. The fifth form is a hyperspace, a 10-dimensional hyperspace that somehow is mysteriously able to be incited as having something to do with an 11-dimensional super reality, but it does not ever occur as such. It occurs as a zero field of nature. One word for that is Tao. Another word for it is shunyata. The English translation of Greek it turns out to be void, the void. Probably the closest that one can come in a mathematical logic is to use the term empty. Not only is the set empty, there is no set. However, one can intuit that that set is functional, but it's functional in the way in which powers are powers of 10 in our convenient usage, based on the factoring in of 0 for each power. 1, 10, 100, 1,000, etc. That the powers of 10 by a 10 base is effective as the powers of 2 are, and that one can now come to understand that nature itself as a zero-dimension integral field at once mysteriously functions as the 11th dimension. The deepest recognition of this particular mystery comes from the classic of the Vajrayana, the Bardo Thodol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When someone dies, the metronome of the immediate, spontaneous occurrence is that a clear light occurs, and if one can recognize, if one can remember, if one can creatively position imaginatively oneself in the clear light, you are immediately taken out of any more rebirths, out of any more karma. If this does not spontaneously immediately occur, the first set of 7 days are the peaceful deities that come to help you, to guide you. If none of those work, the next 7 days are the wrathful deities that are meant to blow apart and corrode into subatomic karmic waves that now must go through a whole incredibly long cycle of reforming, reassembling. And after that, there are other sets, 4 more sets of 7, and then a 7th set of 7, so that the entire bardo in its 3 forms, the first is the instantaneous Chikai bardo, then comes the Chonyed bardo, then the Sidpa bardo. Those 49 days, 7 sevens, are like the 7 Sabbaths that in the ancient Hebrew understanding, the 50th day is the Jubilee day. It is the Sabbath of Sabbaths, and it is the 50th that makes then the set of the 7 sevens. And each one of the 7th of those 7 sevens is already a harmonic, so that you have a set of 7 harmonies in a superharmonic. What's interesting is that the first 7 days there are 5 dhyani Buddhas that occur, each one a little less powerful than the previous one. And on the 6th day, all 5 occur together as an ensemble. And if you are still not saved, the 7th day, every spiritual saved soul in paradise call out to you together. It's like a Sunday in paradise, a Sabbath in paradise. They all invite you to be free and to be saved. What is interesting is that those 5 dhyani Buddhas, each one has a companion, a female companion. And after the first 2, Vairocana is the first dhyani Buddha. After that, not only is there a paired male-female tuned Buddha, dhyani Buddha, but under them are pairs of bodhisattvas. Each one of them is paired. And when you add up all of the spiritual guides that come together, they form a set of 42. The same number as the generations of Abraham to Jesus, the same number of temple hymns of Eniduana, 2400 BC, the same number of the 42 hymns of Mary Magdalene wrote about Jesus, the Odes of Solomon, and one finds again and again because it is 3/14. It is not just a duality, but it's pairedness that counts. But the pairedness is in a symmetry that has a mysterious base, not a unification base. And the mysteriousness comes in because the first pair actually tuned is 0 and 1. So that 2 is the one put into halves, each one of which would be a 1, and expressed as a unification, that the 1/2 is not just 1/2 of 1, but is a unity in itself, so that 2 is not just 2 ones, which would make a duality, but it is the pairing of ratioing of proportions to make a further unification, so that 2 is actually, as a number, is a unification also. It's a unity as well, which is why it holds up, because unities hold by polarity. 3 as a unity holds by its polarity of the 2 and the original 1. And in this way, one is able to step up and understand that the polarities are what cinch in pairedness the structures that hold in an integral. And it is the reversal of the polarity into a complementarity that frees it up then to go outside of the integral limitations, to let go of the unification presupposition that has been carried all the time, and to recognize the functional ability of carrying your zeros in the ordinal powers of your integral calculations give you an ability to refine oneself indefinitely to approach 1 or 0, but to also approach 1 or infinity. And so what is born is a beginning of higher mathematics that in the West was brought into focus by 2 great individuals at the same time, Leibniz in Germany and Sir Isaac Newton in England. Newton's Principia is the classic expression of it, 1687, but we use the notation of Leibniz because his notation is more accurate. Leibniz based it on a translation of the Chinese I Ching translated by Jesuit missionaries in China and brought to the Netherlands by Dutch traders from Indonesia. And the Latin translation was read by 20-year-old Leibniz because he heard of it from a great Jewish philosopher, Spinoza, who lived there in the Netherlands at that time, who was sort of an ex officio, not really a member in good standing of the community, but he and Leibniz understood that there is something here. Tao and Te are the 0 and 1. Yin and Yang are the two polarized halves of the Te, of the 1. So that a pair is a better way to understand, and if one carries not the idea of pairedness, but the theoretical consciousness of the differentiality of pairedness, now one understands that pairs paired will make a square, and squares paired will make an 8-fold, an ogdoad, an octet. It will give you a harmonic set by which you can now make music possible, rather than just having percussion and having traditional compositions. One now, for the very first time, is able to really make musics. What we're getting at here is that our species has been undergoing a refinement for about 5,000 years, since 3000 BC. But in the last 2,500 years, one half of that, it was stepped up so that the time forms in an integral cycle have their arithmetical relationality, but in a differential conscious ecology, they have also a mathematical approach to a mysteriousness. When we look next week at the structure of a star system civilization, we're struck by the fact that there are 4 major planets, rocky planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. And then there is a series of the asteroid belt. Then there are 4 gas giant planets: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. And having discovered it just about 10 years ago, that there is a larger giant asteroid belt, the Kuiper belt. So that you have 4 planets, and then you have a set of scattered asteroids. You have 4 larger planets, and then a larger set. So that our star system has a very curious kind of a unity to it. It has a peculiar ratioable unity, which makes our star system extremely rare. There are any number of star systems. They hardly ever occur like ours does, with this kind of mathematical development of a fundamental geometricity into a mysteriousness. We have in our species now for at least 50,000 years, 40,000 confirmably, by the development of art, which showed that there were spiritually prismatic men and women at least 40,000 and probably 50,000 years ago, after the species already had evolved for over 150,000 years before that. And that in the last 5,000 years, we have begun to have science available as a further development, harmonically linked to art. But that especially the linking of science to art received a jump about 500 years ago. We call it the Renaissance. So that learning is not just learning in schools, then it's learning in a university that pairs the arts and sciences together. They're colloquially called sometimes the humanities. Those who study in this way, those that learn in this way, those that teach in this way are then humanists. But the understanding is that the humanities, the humanists, carried over medieval ideas of integral disciplines that came to dominate increasingly in the early 20th century because of a radical regression. And the regression came as a result of the First World War. The result was cemented into operation in 1919 when the whole process of business, corporate business, holding trust, empires, recut the educational format so that it was limited to subjects that were separated and disciplines that had their own unification within themselves, so that in the 1960s, the difficult issue to work with such encumbrances was to try to find ways to be interdisciplinary. And the interdisciplinariness never really took hold, but became a faux, phantom, shadowboxing strategy, because it had no real spiritual art of prismatic person creating, and had no way to have an access outside of the idea of a university to the appreciation of the beauty of and the analytic study of the cosmos as a form that allows us to come into contact through a complementarity of 9 dimensions with a silent realization that exceeds integrals, exceeds the complementarities, and opens us up to a 10-dimensional mystery, which generates, without generating, an 11th dimension that functions as a zero-field nature, which is fertile, so that it is an emptiness not of voidness, but of superfullness, called a pleroma. It is fertile, to use an old simile, the way in which, if there were not the darkness of the pupils in the eye, the image would have no way of entering and occurring. And when it does, it enters upside down. It's only in the brain that the image is right-sided up. Not so that there is a correlation of referentiality to the world, but so that there is a tuned pairedness of the way in which the mind learns that it must also use the complementarity to allow seeing to become a vision. So that when one dreams or one visions, one dreams right side up. You're not looking at something through the pupil of the eye. When one visions, one doesn't vision an upside down world. One visions a right side up world, which shows that the ability to see naturally in the integral includes already the necessity, as it were, for including as the real the complementariness of it. We're going to, next week, take a look at something that was extraordinary. Richard Feynman, going so far in investigating work on the Manhattan Project, on the atomic bomb, work after the Second World War in some of the most esoteric meetings ever held, the Shelter Island conferences off Long Island of New York, and the realization that in order to express symbolically what was occurring was facilitated by not using the ordinary mathematics at all, but using a mathematic that is diagrammatic of what actually is occurring without wanting to label it. And we'll see with Feynman diagrams, which are used all over the world today, was the opening of the ability to get to what is now not only string theory and M theory and F theory, but on the verge of being able to understand mystery theory. More next week.